Thank you, Carl, for the introduction, and hello, my name is Lynne. As Charlotte has said, there's a number of nurses who have been invested in Northern Ireland in terms of QI, quality improvement, and I'm fortunate enough to be one of them. So I'm here today to talk about learning to be an improvement advisor, but when they told me I had 15 minutes, I thought I could talk for 15 hours about that, and most of you in the room who know me know that's true. And I could talk about many things around the QI methodology, PDSAs, tests of change, all of those things, but I know you're going to hear about those later on in the presentation, in the QI presentation. So I wanted to talk basically about what are the main impacts in my everyday practice, because I loved every minute of the QI course genuinely, and I could see the potential it had to improve the quality of care that we give to our service users. So some of the things I'm going to talk about are the tools for understanding variation, least ink for most information, scale and matters, aggregated data, trends and shifts, and RAG rate. Now that sounds like a whole lot, but I'm going to fly through it. So it struck me actually when I was thinking about this in terms of tools for understanding variation. I had a role that was about producing quality reports and safety reports to our board, to external trusts, internally to directorates and assurance committee. I didn't understand variation. I didn't really know what variation meant, basically. Anyway, so I didn't understand what variation meant, and I think in terms of nurses and midwives, we're now being given a wealth of quality and safety information and being asked to understand that information, to consider the information, and we have a duty to act, of course, on what that information is telling us. But we can only do that if we understand the information and we understand what variation means. So these are a few charts. One of the guys who taught us in the course was called Bob Lloyd. Many of you in the room may know Bob. And Bob is always on my shoulder every day when I'm thinking about data. And this is one of the slides that Bob had put onto his presentation when he was teaching us about a real bar chart. So in terms of the value of a bar chart, really what it meant was this is really how effective it was in some cases. He also showed us this other one, which was a candy bar chart. And he also talked about the value of pie charts. And as you can see here, pie I've eaten, pie I haven't. This is Edward Tufte, who is really a pioneer of visual information. And Edward Tufte here has said the only worse design than a pie chart is several of them. And every day when I'm thinking about how to present the data and how to present the data in terms of variation, I'm thinking about these quotes and thinking about how we can do it in a way that lets people understand the variation in the data. There are so many ways that we can present the data in a way that helps us understand, is the variation normal variation? In other words, is it just part of the normal processes? Or is it in fact special variation in terms of things that might affect the data in a special way? So to put that into context, if we consider somebody's car journey to work, every day it might take you 25 minutes or 35 minutes, and that might be affected potentially by the traffic lights, the speed of the traffic in front of you, different things like that. But we know that you can expect it's going to be a range between 25 and 35 minutes, and that's fairly normal variation and common cause variation, and it's just about the process. However, if it takes you 50 minutes one particular day, that might be because of a flat tire, or it might be, for example, because of roadworks, and that is a very special cause of variation. And what we tend to do in healthcare is act very quickly in normal variation, where actually it's not really the things that we need to be considering. One of the other tools that we had as well, when resources are so light and we don't have the sort of resources, and as Charlotte said, the coaches and mentors, etc., that we need, sometimes it's important for us to understand, determine the vital few components that we should work on, as opposed to trying to look at everything in terms of QI all at once. So for example, this is a piece of work that we have been doing in the Public Health Agency around looking at non-compliant elements with the falls bundle. And if we were trying to fix all of it at once, we just wouldn't simply have the resource. So you can see here that the 80-20 rule applies in a Pareto chart. And Pareto, of course, was an Italian economist, and he figured out that 80% of the land in Italy was owned by 20% of the people. And then Joseph Duran, who was also a quality improvement guru, he realised that this applied to many other things. So, for example, 80% of your complaints come from potentially 20% of your services, 80% of your income comes from 20% of your services, etc. So he coined the phrase then, the vital few, and the other many. So basically, we looked at this and we understood that really the things that we need to focus on were the lying and standing BP and the cognitive screening and urinalysis. And that allowed us to take the work forward then without basically trying to focus on everything at once and more impact and outcome. Some of the skills that we learned also allowed us to stratify the data to understand basically where there's positive deviance. So how can we learn? We're very good in healthcare at learning from where things have gone wrong, but how can we actually understand and learn from where things have gone right? Try and look at where experience is good, try and understand where practice is good, and understand how can we learn from that as opposed to always focusing on the negative. And this slide just shows the data from 4 trusts in terms of compliance with lying and standing blood pressure. And you can see in terms of trustee there, very visually, and on one page we can see that trustee actually has very good performance around that. So we need to understand, are they recording the data in the same way? And also, is it actually something that we can learn from in terms of their practice? This is something that I was definitely guilty of before I went on the course in terms of the least ink for the most information. So, for example, we have been shown some slides like this. Now, Edward Tufte, the guy who I showed you in the slides earlier, is the pioneer of visual information, as I said. He's been coined as the Leonardo da Vinci of visual data by the New York Times. And basically, he has said he argues against any decorative sort of data, or any decoration on quantitative data. So you can see here we've got quite a lot of colour. He calls that chart junk and says we should have nothing on a slide that has no purpose, no information. Again, you can see samples of these, but you can understand for a board member or for any of our teams where we're sharing information, this is really difficult to interpret. And so one of the graphs that he argues that we should be using really data-rich illustrations that show us lots of information in a small space. And what he says is it should be the least ink for the greatest information in the smallest space. And this particular slide is Joseph Minard's dramatic account of Napoleon's War, and right back in 1861 this was shown. And this slide has always stuck with me, and it was shown to us on our course. And what you can see here, this pointer doesn't work, but at the beginning you can see this is about Napoleon's Russian campaign, and basically there were 422,000 men who started in his army in Moscow. And the light grey bar basically shows their travel towards Moscow, where they hoped to invade the Russian army. But by the time they got to Moscow, the Russian army had burnt many of the areas in between, and they had no food or and nothing that they could gain from the environment. So by the time they got to Moscow, there was only 100,000 men there, and they had lost 322. The black line shows them actually coming back, but this was during the winter. And so you can see there's a very narrow line depicting that many of them have died. And in fact, when they get back to Poland, there's only 10,000 men there. But Tufte concludes that this is probably the best statistical graphic ever drawn because it shows 6 different variables simultaneously on the graph. So it shows the size of the army, the location, the 2-dimensional surface, the direction of the army's movement, and it also shows the temperature on various dates during the retreats. So by looking at one graph, you can see so much information. This is another one that really stuck with me as well, and this again was from 1854 when Dr. John Snow used a dot location map to plot the location of deaths due to cholera. Now, I'm not sure if you can see that on the screen, but the circle is round this pump, so the red dots indicate the location of the water pumps. So, and the black bars, they show the number of deaths from cholera. And from doing this very simple graph and putting it all onto one page, you could see that actually it was one particular pump that was probably the one that was causing the problems. So he had the handle of the pump removed, and the cholera epidemic then that claimed over 500 lives then came to an end. Now, it may have came to an end anyway, but certainly this work is quite pioneering. So what Tufte and what the course would have taught us is that you show only the information that has any meaning. So you have your graph here, and obviously you have some annotations. It gives the most information for the least ink, and it's easy to read, and there's nothing there that shouldn't be there. Another way of sort of showing the data in a way that means for people who are looking at board reports and 70-page reports and trying to understand the data, how can we make the data more succinct? So basically here we have 22 our overall system and 22 districts for primary care systems. And you can see over on the left-hand side, you have one graph showing the overarching graph. and then the other 22 systems there. Immediately when you look at that, you can see that the waiting times are much higher in some of them than others. So for example, in the top right small graph, the waiting times appear to be much higher than they are, for example, down in the bottom two graphs. So it's about understanding that for somebody who's got lots of papers to go through and making it simple for them to appreciate what variation do we need to understand, what do we need to learn from the variation, and what actions need to be taken. One of the other things I think was very important in terms of the course, and very important when we consider our duty of quality, our board effectiveness, when we consider effective nursing insurance, things like scaling does matter. So again, when people are going through lots of information and lots of reports, this is C sections here in 3 particular graphs, but they're all the same information, but the scale up the side of the graph is different in them all. So you can imagine if you were a board member potentially, or an assurance committee, or somebody within your nursing directorate and midwifery directorate, you'll be able to see here that actually the bottom graph may cause no concern to somebody actually looking at that. But of course, if they were looking at the graph on the bottom right as opposed to the bottom left, that actually might give grave cause for concern and signal a reason to understand what the potential issues might be there and what actions need to be taken around them. Aggregated data is something that I would have used and we would have used as a team in the Public Health Agency when we were presenting data to the board and obviously presenting on behalf of the region. And in terms of aggregated data, I remember the slide vividly when Bob Lloyd put that up. And again, Bob is somebody who I find is constantly on my shoulder most days. The aggregated data presented in tabular formats or the use of summary statistics, it doesn't help you measure the process improvement efforts. So in other words, he talks about it being data that's used for judgment and not for improvement. So for example, looking at data between 2 points in time and making a judgment on it as opposed to understanding the variables in between. So he used this slide as well, and I think it does sort of give us some sense of some judgments we can make when we look at data in that way. It says here that only 50% of all improvement advisors are above average. And it's those types of statements and those types of things that can actually mislead us in our efforts to improve. This slide actually shows CABG mortality, so coronary artery bypass mortality, and it shows actually that a new protocol was implemented. So the first bar on the left-hand side shows that at the time 1, that the mortality was 5%, and then at time 2, after the protocol had been introduced, it was 4%. And so some of the discussions around that might be, we've had a significant drop from 5% to 4%, so that protocol was a real success, 20% drop in average mortality. And that's what happens when we look at data in 2 points in time instead of continuous data. Now here's the same data presented in a control chart for us to understand the variation. And on the left-hand side there, you'll see that the mortality starts at 9 and goes down to just above 1% there at the point of 12 months when the protocol was implemented. But actually what happens after the protocol is implemented is that the actual mortality increases and continues to increase. And so what's happened here is, because we've looked at only 2 points at time, we've made a conclusion that the protocol is very successful, when in fact when you look at the data in this particular way, you'll see that actually the mortality is going up again. And I think it just demonstrates the point to us as to how important it is for us to really give our boards and our assurance committees and everybody else that we're sharing our quality data with, and indeed ourselves when we're looking at it, to give them the data in a format and in a presentation style that allows them to understand and to make decisions and to make judgments. Because most decision makers, whether they're managerial or whether they're clinical, they actually understand very well the daily challenges on the ground. But do we really understand the format that the information is given to us in? And can we really be held to account for making decisions on information that's given to us in a format that's misleading? But we are. We had historically, on the left-hand side there, you'll see we had, in our regional reports, we had presented our data in terms of aggregated data. So the top bar chart shows the regional number of falls. It's a rate per 1,000 days, and we would have presented it in a table. But we have moved now to presenting it in these small multiples, so the graphs on the right-hand side mean that we can show it to our board and they can understand the variances between each of the other trusts. Again, looking at tables like this on the left-hand side in and amongst 70 other papers can be quite challenging, and again, it's quite difficult to interpret if you're not close to the actual data. Learning from the variation, as I said to you, there are special causes that we can see within this data. This is not really a teaching session, but it did allow us then to understand where we needed to go and learn and understand what that variation or the cause of that variation was. And what they've found is in about 96% of companies, the variation is due to the process, not to the people. And so if you try to change individuals or it's attributed as blame as opposed to learning, then what you don't really change or improve. Often it's the process that needs changed. So for example, in the car journey, it would be changing your route as opposed to changing the driver, that type of thing. Again, as I said before, it's the least ink for the most information, but aggregated data must be broken down so that we can understand where we have variances. And sometimes aggregated data can show that there is quite a steady, stable process with no decline or no improvements. But when you break it into small multiples, say for example if it was in your hospital and you look at all of your wards individually, you might understand that you have wards that are either very challenged and need more support, or you may have wards that actually have very, very positive outcomes, and you need to understand how can we learn from that positive deviance. Just very quickly, I wanted to say that as I said, I've been working in quality and safety for some time, and I've been referring to graphs for many years, talking about trends and shifts. I didn't know what a trend and shift was until I went in the IHI improvement course. I didn't appreciate that for a run chart, a trend needed to be 5 or more consecutive in one direction, for example. So I also didn't appreciate like an astronomical point down. I never even heard of an astronomical point. So I think that it's just important that this is what also struck me during the course is it's all fairly simplistic. It's not difficult, and I think that it's important for us to know that when we are looking at data that we're not making assumptions that are based on no findings. And then one of the final things just to say is that in healthcare and in KPIs, and we have heard all the discussions around the amount of data that staff are trying to collect on the ground and the burden of data collection and the need for feedback if we are going to be collecting it. One of the things we found in the PHA is that of course we're collecting data on a quarterly basis, and in terms of what I've just said to you there about a trend or a shift, if we need 5 data points to tell us that we have a trend, that means when we were getting our regional data in the Public Health Agency that was about a year and a half before we understood that we either had a trend in a positive direction or a trend that was showing a decline in performance. So we really, the slide in itself there says that if you're serious about your quality improvement efforts, you should be collecting and analysing data as close as possible to the production of the data. And what would it take to collect data in individual patients, and how often could we do it, and what would the frequency be like? And I think there is a point in saying, should we be collecting less and looking at less more frequently so that we can truly make improvement efforts around it. This is one of the last slides, but we use RAG rating quite often, so red, amber, green rating, and I don't expect you to see the detail on this here, but it's about hospital level system measures something that we might share with the board or an assurance committee, and we use the RAG rating here, red, amber and green. And again, in some cases, we've all been in the position where our RAG status has been very green, C's of green, and then things have happened and allowed us to go back and look at the data in a more detailed way, and we've understood that perhaps it was giving us a false assurance. And that, of course, is something that we're all trying to work on now. How effective is your assurance, or how assuring is your assurance? If we take that RAG status data and put it into one of our control charts, you'll see here that basically the 2 lines here is just part of the normal process, and anything that falls outside of those is a special cause of variation and is something that we should be looking into further. But here you'll see that the red dots and the green dots are all normal variation, and they're all part of the process that we have, which is predictable and reliable. But it just gives us a sense that we should concentrate more on the reds and less on the green, when actually we should be looking at it all together. So there are quite a few papers about using RAG status for healthcare data and whether it's something that's effective or not, and that's for consideration for us all as we give reports to make decisions on. Finally, I said earlier about difficult conversations, and I just want to finish on this one too, because I learned so much about the data on the IHI course, but one of the things that really taught us about as well was about the ability to prepare for difficult conversations. And it's something that I think I've used quite a lot since we've been on the course. And I just wanted to say that it's a course that covers many, many things, and one that, as I said, I would recommend to anybody, and hopefully with your dosing formulas, there'll be many more people who get the opportunity to go on it. So thank you.